More than 57 million people watched it live. An 81-year-old American judge pointed her finger on national television and strongly accused Africa's youngest president of protecting criminals and ignoring the law. But what shocked everyone was how he reacted. He didn't shout, he didn't argue. He stayed calm and spoke clearly, and what he said completely flipped the conversation. In just under 2 minutes, he revealed something so uncomfortable that the judge couldn't respond. She sat in silence, and suddenly her 30-year reputation began to crack. So what exactly did he say that moved a respected courtroom figure to tears without ever raising his voice? And why are so many people calling this a turning point in the way we think about justice? To understand what happened, let's go back to how it all started. It was supposed to be a typical CNN town hall, the kind of show people watch while doing chores or having evening tea. The stage looked sharp, the lighting was warm, and the set was neat. The audience, a mix of professionals and retirees, sat quietly, expecting a polite, well-managed discussion. There were no protests, no leaks, no surprises expected. At the center of it all was veteran journalist Charles Whitman, ready with his cue cards. His job was to keep the discussion moving and the tone respectful. On one side sat Judge Eleanor Marlowe, 81, known across America from decades on television, wearing a sleek black blazer and her trademark white collar. She looked every bit the tough, confident legal figure the public knew so well. After 30 years on screen, she wasn't just a judge. She was a household name. Facing her was President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, just 37 years old. He leads a country shaped by political unrest and deep challenges. But he didn't come off as power-hungry or showy. Dressed in a simple navy outfit, he greeted people with a steady handshake and serious eyes that seemed more focused on listening than impressing. At first, everything felt routine. The moderator opened with a light joke. "Judge Marlowe, you've been on the bench longer than President Traoré has been alive. Does that make you wise or just old?" The crowd laughed, and Judge Marlowe smiled and played along. "I've been judging since he was in diapers," she said. "Let's hope he didn't bring any tonight." The audience loved it. Even President Traoré chuckled and nodded politely. For a moment, it seemed like a relaxed, respectful exchange between two generations, one of experience, the other of fresh perspective. But things were about to take a very different turn. No one saw it coming. Just moments after the laughter faded, the mood in the room changed fast. Moderator Charles Whitman moved from jokes to serious questions. "President Traoré," he asked, "you've said justice systems need to evolve. What exactly do you mean by that? How do we keep power traditions while still moving forward?" The question was respectful but heavy. President Traoré didn't answer right away. He folded his hands, thinking carefully. Then, in a calm and steady voice, he spoke. "Justice," he said, "can't just be about punishment. We need to ask not only what law was broken, but who's being punished and why." The audience grew quiet, listening closely. "Too often," he went on, Our systems punish without understanding. They were built on outdated ideas, colonial laws, racial bias, and even today, in modern courtrooms, the same people keep getting punished while others walk free. This isn't just happening in Africa. It's everywhere. If we don't ask why some groups are always on the receiving end of justice, then we're not fixing anything. We're just keeping the same people in power. The room was still. Some people nodded. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Judge Marlowe was no longer smiling. Her fingers, once relaxed, started tapping quietly on her knee. A sign. Her long-time viewers knew well. She was irritated. She was getting ready to respond. The energy in the room had completely changed. What began as a respectful exchange between a veteran judge and a young leader was now turning into something more intense. And then it happened. Judge Marlowe suddenly leaned forward, pointed her finger across the table, and spoke sharply, like a judge giving a verdict. "Don't tell me the justice system is broken," she snapped. "I've spent 30 years in real courtrooms, not talk shows, not speeches, real courtrooms. I've seen people from every background, all races, make good and bad choices. And I've held them responsible. That's what justice is. This wasn't just a disagreement. It was a direct challenge. She wasn't debating. She was accusing and putting President Traoré on the defensive in front of the entire world. Live on television. Judge Marlowe's voice grew louder and sharper. Her eyes weren't curious anymore. They were full of judgment. The room went completely still. The host froze, unsure whether to step in. Some people in the audience looked around awkwardly, not sure if they should clap or feel uncomfortable. What started as a polite town hall now felt more like a courtroom showdown, but without any rules. All eyes turned to President Traoré. Everyone expected him to react, to defend himself, to speak up, maybe even raise his voice. The judge's comments had been blunt, personal, and harsh. But he didn't flinch. He stayed seated, still as ever. He didn't blink, didn't move, didn't change his expression. His calm presence only made the tension in the room stronger. Then, quietly, he leaned slightly toward the mic and asked one question. Just one. "Judge Marlowe," he said in a clear, even tone, "in all your 30 years, did you ever stop to ask why the same communities kept showing up in your courtroom?" He wasn't being rude. He wasn't attacking her. He was asking a simple, pointed question, one that hit harder than any argument could have. He wasn't challenging her experience. He was questioning her perspective. And in that moment, the energy shifted again. Judge Marlowe hesitated only for a second. You could see the question caught her off guard. But instead of reflecting or asking for clarity, she sat up straight and responded quickly. With a short scoff and a firm voice, she said, "Because they commit more crimes." The room gasped. Not one person clapped. No one laughed. The air felt heavy, like something had suddenly gone very wrong. Even the host looked stunned. He blinked hard, clearly unsure how to move forward after what had just been said. For years, Judge Marlowe had been a symbol of strong, fair justice. She was respected by millions for her nonsense style and courtroom confidence. But with that one sentence, blunt, unfiltered, and final, something about her image began to shift. Without realizing it, Judge Marlowe had revealed something much bigger than herself, a truth that struck a nerve with millions watching. And across from her sat a man who hadn't shouted, hadn't argued, and yet had brought the entire room to a standstill. The real shock wasn't just in what she said. It was in how weak her words felt when she refused to face the deeper question. After she said, "Because they commit more crimes," it was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Number one clapped. No one laughed. A few people in the audience shifted uncomfortably, but no one said a word. Host Charles Whitman looked nervously at the camera crew, unsure whether to move the conversation along or just let the moment sit. Meanwhile, President Ibrahim Traoré stayed perfectly still. He didn't fidget, didn't blink repeatedly, didn't tighten his jaw. His calmness felt powerful, not like someone giving in, but like someone completely in control. It wasn't the silence of defeat. It was the silence of someone who had faced far worse, someone who had already survived much harder rooms than this. Judge Marlowe clearly expected a reaction. You could see it in her face. She was bracing for a fight, ready to argue. But that fight never came. Instead, all she got was his steady gaze, calm, focused, and unbothered. He didn't glare. He didn't look away. He simply looked at her directly and confidently, and that look, free of fear or flattery, began to quietly unravel the image she had spent decades building. The image of total authority, of always being right, of always being in charge. And for the first time, that image started to fade. The silence went on, long enough for the crowd to start feeling it in their bones. People shifted in their seats. Someone cleared their throat. A woman in the front row looked down at her hands. From the back of the room, a man muttered under his breath, "Jesus." This wasn't just a pause. It was a moment of truth happening right in front of everyone. The balance of power had shifted, and most people didn't realize it until it was already done. Then, with no build-up or theatrics, President Traoré leaned in just slightly, just enough for the mic to catch his voice. "What if," he began slowly, "the system isn't broken?" The room went so quiet you could hear the soft buzz of the studio lights. "What if it was built this way?" he continued. "Built from the beginning to see some people as criminals before they even speak." He didn't mention names. He didn't point fingers. He didn't bring up race or specific countries or history books. He didn't have to. What he said went deeper, exposing a pattern so old, so woven into the fabric of legal systems worldwide, that people had stopped noticing it altogether. The audience didn't dare move. Some leaned forward, as if their bodies were trying to make sure. They caught every word. Even the host, usually calm and controlled, blinked slowly and straightened his back, as though something deep beneath the surface had shifted. And Judge Marlowe, she didn't reply. Her fingers stopped moving. Her shoulders, once firm and upright, now sat just a little lower. Her face didn't change much. but something in her posture did. Then President Traoré spoke again, not to frame, but to reveal. His tone stayed calm. His words were sharp, but never loud. He didn't shout. He didn't wave his hands. "These aren't opinions," he said. "They're facts, your facts, from your courts, from your federal sentencing records, from your own Justice Department's data. I'm not here to make you feel guilty," he added. "I'm here to help you see what's always been right in front of us." He paused for a second, not to be dramatic, just to take a breath. "And if those numbers hurt to hear, it's not because they're exaggerated, it's because they're real." That line hit hard, soft in delivery, firm in truth. Anger, no pride, just clarity. And even then he didn't smile, he didn't gloat, he didn't scan the room for approval. He just let the truth settle. President Traoré didn't say another word. He simply sat in silence, calm and steady, letting the weight of what he'd just said settle over the room like dust slowly falling through the air. But this wasn't just any silence. The audience wasn't bored or distracted. They were fully present, focused. A stillness filled the space, the kind that happens when something meaningful is unfolding. Even Judge Marlowe seemed to sense it, not the satisfaction of winning an argument or regaining control. This felt different. The quiet, unsettling realization that maybe, just maybe, the truth had been sitting right in front of her all along, and she hadn't seen it. President Traoré stayed motionless for a long moment. He had already shaken the room without raising his voice. But now, the silence around him began to shift, not just quiet, but sacred, like something deeper was coming. And when he finally spoke again, it wasn't the voice of a politician or a leader. It was the voice of a son. "When I was 8 years old," he began, quietly, "I watched my father get dragged out of our home by armed men." He didn't say it dramatically. He didn't dress it up. But the look in his eyes told you everything. This wasn't a rehearsed story. This was a memory, real, raw, painful. "It was just after sunset," he continued, his voice steady but heavy. "My sister and I were sitting on the floor, working on our school assignments by candlelight." President Traoré continued. "The power had gone out again. It happened often. My mother was in the next room, cooking rice." Then he paused and said one word, "Boots." That one word hit the room like a jolt. Everyone knew what was coming. They didn't knock. They didn't say anything. They just kicked the door open. There were 4 of them, rifles on their backs, flashlights on their shoulders. One grabbed my father by the collar. The others started ripping through our home, turning over books, furniture, anything, like they were searching for something that didn't exist. He stopped speaking for a few seconds, like he was replaying it in his mind, every detail, every second. "My father was a teacher," he said, his voice quieter. "He taught math and poetry to kids who couldn't even afford pencils. That's what he did. That's what they took him for." Now the emotion was catching up, not in tears, but in the rhythm of his voice, slower, heavier, like he was speaking with the full weight of the past pressing down on him. I still remember the sound of the pot dropping from my mother's hand. I still remember my sister's face. Not fear, just confusion. Because we didn't understand. We thought they had the wrong house. They had two, but they didn't. His hands, which had been still on the table, now folded over each other. Not nervous, but like he was trying to hold onto something fragile. They beat him in the street, right in front of us. No questions, no reason. Just fists, boots, bend, silence. They didn't tell us where they were taking him. They didn't say why. They just left. And my father, the man who told us bedtime stories and taught us how to multiply, was gone. The room was frozen. No one moved. No one made a sound. What started as a political discussion had become something far more personal. A painful truth that demanded to be heard. But Ibrahim didn't stop there. 2 months later, he said quietly, they came back. This time, it wasn't for his father. They came for my uncle. His voice was flatter now. Not cold, just worn, like someone who had carried this pain for a long time. My uncle was a poet. He wrote in little notebooks he hid under loose floorboards. Sometimes he'd read his poems to my mother when they thought we were asleep. His words burned with truth, not anger. He believed in beauty, in ideas, in change. That's what made him dangerous, Ibrahim said quietly, deliberately. Now, his words came slower, more careful, like he was walking across sharp, painful memories, one step at a time. They called him a subversive, he said. I didn't know what that meant. Honestly, I'm not sure they did either. They didn't show a warrant. They didn't name any charges. They just came in broad daylight and pulled him out of our aunt's house. For the first time during the entire evening, Ibrahim looked down, breaking eye contact with the audience. My mother was holding a spoon when the shouting started, he said. She dropped it. I remember the sound it made when it hit the floor. Then she picked it up and dropped it again, like her body couldn't decide whether to fight or freeze. He let the silence sit, and then he spoke 3 words. Simple, quiet, but final. We never saw him again. No trial, no grave, no official explanation, no name on any list, just gone. Those words didn't just land, they lingered, heavy, permanent. The kind of silence that follows only deep loss. Then Ibrahim looked up again, not with rage, not even sadness, with clarity, a calm rooted in truth, the kind that comes from someone who has lived through things most people couldn't even imagine. Then came the line that changed everything. That, Ibrahim said softly, was my first courtroom. He paused. Not a building, a street. The words hit like a final blow, not loud but undeniable. A truth that didn't need to be shouted to be felt. No judge, just fear. He added, letting the words settle into the silence. He wasn't speaking to make a point. He was bearing witness. Before I studied law, before I wore a suit or stood behind a microphone, I learned what it means to be judged without being heard, to be punished without a verdict, to lose the people you love, not to war, but to silence. That, he said, was my first experience with justice. By now, the room had shifted entirely. This wasn't just a talk anymore. It was something more. People weren't just listening. They were feeling it. Some audience members had their hands folded tight. Others sat frozen, tears quietly running down their faces. Even Judge Marlowe, silent until now, looked changed. Her hand covered her mouth. Her sharp, unwavering gaze had softened. She no longer looked like someone with all the answers. Then Ibrahim leaned back just a little, and with quiet strength, he delivered his closing thought. "That's why I'm here," he said. "Not just to speak, but to make sure that the courtroom that shaped me, the one with no roof and no justice, never becomes the model for what justice is supposed to be." Judge Elelana Marlowe had sat on many stages in her life. She had faced off with lawyers, politicians, even entire audiences, and often left them speechless. She was known for putting young, overconfident attorneys in their place, especially the ones who came with facts, but no lived experience. She thought she knew how to handle pushback. But this was different, because when President Traoré finished, not with blame, not with anger, but with quiet, devastating honesty, she leaned back in her chair, and then she did what had always worked for her. Judge Marlowe straightened up, her voice regaining some of its old sharpness. "You and your numbers," she said. "There's always a chart, a study, a percentage." She even gave a slight smirk, the kind that once drew laughter from her daytime TV fans. "I've worked in the real world," she added, "not just on paper." A few people chuckled awkwardly. One older man near the front clapped, not with confidence, more like he wasn't sure whether he was agreeing with her or just trying to break the tension. But something had changed. That usual authority, the command she was known for, wasn't there anymore. Her response felt automatic, like a habit. The words still sounded firm, but the power behind them had faded. She wasn't guiding the room now. She was trying to keep up with it, and Ibrahim Traoré knew it. Still, he didn't show any pride. He didn't smile. He didn't shake his head. He just waited, patient, still grounded. And once her words had landed, not like applause, but like dust settling, he leaned forward again, calm, composed. He looked her in the eyes, not with anger, not with defiance, just clarity. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, quiet but full of weight, he said, "If justice is blind, why does it always seem to see race before it sees evidence?" The effect was instant, not loud, but powerful. The room didn't explode. It sank into a deeper silence, the kind that says everything. A young black woman in the third row covered her mouth. Two students sitting side by side exchanged a stunned glance. Even the host, who had been steady all evening, froze, his hand still resting on his cue cards. That sentence didn't shout. It didn't attack. It revealed. It wasn't aimed. Judge Marlowe. It cut through the entire system. With that single line, Ibrahim Traoré wasn't arguing anymore. He was exposing something everyone had seen but never named. And for the first time all night, Judge Marlowe didn't respond. She parted her lips slightly, as if she might speak. Cameras caught the faint inhale, but no words followed. Her eyes, always direct and commanding, slowly shifted downward, not in surrender, but in doubt. She blinked once. Then again, like someone suddenly seeing through a fog they hadn't known was there. Her hands, once neatly folded, now moved slightly, her fingers gently brushing each other, like someone searching for steady ground. Something had shifted, and it wasn't just in Judge Marlowe. It was in the room. Something that had once been solid, unshakable, was suddenly gone. And nobody tried to interrupt, because they didn't need to. The moment was too powerful. What the audience was witnessing wasn't a debate being lost. It was the quiet, undeniable moment when a legacy began to crack. For 3 decades, Judge Marlowe had been the public face of justice, firm, confident, unfiltered. She had ruled courtrooms and television screens alike. But now, faced with a truth she couldn't outtalk or dismiss with a clever line, she had nothing to say, not because someone stopped her, but because there was nothing left to say. And across from her sat a man who had spoken all the truth that needed speaking without ever raising his voice. No one clapped. There was no dramatic music, no commercial break, no grand closing, just silence. But it was the kind of silence that doesn't fade. It hums beneath your skin. That stillness, that electricity, stayed with people. Within minutes after the live broadcast ended, audience members reached for their phones, not to snap selfies or post reactions, but to share what they had just seen. And they didn't need the whole conversation. They only needed those 48 seconds. The moment President Ibrahim Traoré leaned in and quietly asked, "If justice is blind, why does it always seem to see race before it sees evidence?" The clip first appeared on Twitter, then TikTok, then Instagram Reels and YouTube Shorts. No background music, no flashy edits. Just the question, the silence, and Judge Marlowe blinking in reply. Within 2 hours, the video had over 6 million views. By the end of the day, Silence by Traoré was trending in 22 countries. But it wasn't just the number of views that made this moment historic. It was how people responded. This wasn't like other viral clips filled with sarcasm, memes, and loud opinions. This one spread with quiet reverence. People weren't sharing it to score points. They were sharing it to remember, to reflect, to ask themselves the same hard question. Newsrooms couldn't ignore it. By the next morning, major headlines around the world led with the same theme. Politico called it the moment television became unsafe for power. The Atlantic published a feature titled "The Softest Knockout in History." Rolling Stone described it as a silent earthquake in the House of Justice. But it was the captions on social media that sealed its place in public memory. Twitter lit up with lines like, "When truth walked in, ego walked out." He didn't argue, he revealed. On Reddit, one user wrote, "That's the most respectful obliteration I've ever seen." Another called it a courtroom in disguise, and he won without a gavel. The hashtags told their own story. Hashtag silence by Traore. Hashtag truth before volume. Hashtag to justice reimagined. Hashtag the question that stung. What made this moment different wasn't just how widely it was shared, bitwise, how deeply it was felt. It wasn't just a political soundbite. It became a mirror. And whether you were a journalist, a teacher, a student, or just scrolling through your phone, you couldn't look away, because somehow it was no longer about him. It was about all of us. In the days that followed, the impact of that moment left the screen and stepped into the real world. In Ouagadougou, students began painting murals across their university walls, images of President Traoré seated at the debate table, calm, composed, hands folded, eyes steady. Beneath each painting were the same simple words. He didn't shout, he told the truth. Soon, those same words started appearing in other cities on street art, posters, and billboards in Accra, Johannesburg, and Nairobi, even in cafes across Paris and Brussels. The conversation wasn't about politics anymore. It was about perception, about who gets heard, about who gets silenced before they ever get the chance to speak. At Howard University in Washington, D.C., what began as a small group watching the clip turned into something much bigger. A few students gathered to share the video. By the end of the night, over 500 people filled the auditorium. They didn't just watch, they responded. An open mic followed, and dozens of students lined up not to discuss politics, but to share their own stories. Stories of being silenced in classrooms, traffic stops, courtrooms, boardrooms. One young woman, her voice shaking, said, "He spoke the way I wish my father had, quiet, but impossible to ignore." Another added, "That one sentence. It made me realize I've waited my whole life for someone to ask that question out loud." The power of the moment wasn't in how far it spread, but in how deeply it resonated. This wasn't entertainment. It wasn't political theater. It was a quiet reckoning, a truth that didn't erupt in anger, but settled in hearts. People didn't just witness drama, they saw themselves. Even after the cameras stopped, after the hashtags faded, the moment remained. What made it unforgettable wasn't the clash, it was the stillness that followed. In a time where shouting is often mistaken for courage, where outrage gets confused with truth, President Ibrahim Traoré gave the world something different. Presence. He didn't mock. He didn't yell. He didn't try to dominate the room. He stood in truth and let the silence speak for itself. That silence, steady, clear, unshaken, did more than fill the gaps between words. It was the message, because real power doesn't always raise its voice. Sometimes it lowers it. Sometimes it simply waits, listens, and then responds. That's what the world saw that night. Not a man defeating a woman, not a politician scoring points, but something far rarer. Truth, standing firm, unafraid, pure, and impossible to ignore. And now, it's more than just a story we remember. It's a question we quietly carry with us. A question we must each face. Have you ever stayed silent? Not because you had nothing to say, but because you knew no one would listen. Have you ever held back a truth so strong it burned in your chest, simply because you thought no one would truly hear it? Most of us have. We've sat in rooms where louder voices drowned us out. We've stayed quiet to keep the peace. We've watched unfairness pass by, dressed in the clothes of tradition. And in those moments, we told ourselves that silence meant survival. But what if, like Ibrahim, we chose something different? What if we stopped shouting just to be heard, and instead stood still so we could be felt? What if the courage we admire in others is the same courage we've had all along, just waiting for the right moment to rise? His calm wasn't weakness, it was discipline. His silence wasn't retreat, it was strategy. And when he did speak, it wasn't loud, but it was unforgettable. For decades, Judge Eleanor Marlowe symbolized justice to millions. Her name became the stand-in for fairness and order. Her gavel, her stare, her sharp tongue, all part of a persona that seemed untouchable. But in that studio, something changed. Not because she was defeated or embarrassed, but because, for the first time, someone asked her and all of us to look deeper, to ask what justice really means. Her legacy wasn't erased that night. It was redefined, because when people looked up from their screens, they didn't see a woman being overpowered. They saw a man bring something rare into a place of power, clarity, memory, truth, not with force, but with presence. A truth that didn't knock it, walked right in. And from that moment on, whenever people talk about justice, not as punishment, but as presence, they'll remember a man who didn't demand attention. He simply sat still, spoke softly, and changed everything.